Okay, so today we need to talk about using the direct versus the indirect approach. Another way to think about this is that it really is a lesson on how to deliver bad news versus good news. And this correlates to page 119 in your book. That was part of the reading for the week on business letters. But really the strategies can be applied to writing in any format, email, business letter, memo, or speaking as well. So I'd like to start with just this little 30-second clip from NPR about the first African-American ballerina, I think, to get into the National Ballet, talking about some of the rejection she experienced before she was successful in ballet.
The dancer Misty Copeland appeared recently in a commercial.
It was an ad for Under Armour, and it was one of those commercials that delivered a gut punch of a message.
What you see is Copeland dancing beautifully on screen.
What you hear is the voice of a girl reading a rejection letter she's just received from a ballet school.
Dear candidate, thank you for your application to our ballet academy. Unfortunately, you have not been accepted. You lack the right feet, Achilles tendons, turnout, torso length, and bust. You have the wrong body for ballet, and at 13, you are too old to be considered.
Ouch. It's widely believed.
So you might pause for a moment and think about that letter and whether the information delivered was appropriate or not, whether it could have been delivered in a different way. So the same message, but in a way that maybe wasn't so potentially damaging to a young dancer. Here's another example of bad news from my own personal file of rejection. So I do a little bit of writing on the side, mostly essays, and so here are two rejection letters. I'll read the larger one first, and then you can contrast that with the smaller one. So the larger one says, Dear Jill Sisson Quinn, thank you for your submission to Memoir and. That was the name of the magazine. Memoir writing takes courage. Showing a memoir to others can be even more difficult. We appreciate you gave us the opportunity to read your work, and we found value in it. Unfortunately, we receive many submissions and have limited space in which to publish them. We regret to say we must decline yours at this time. We look forward to your next submission. So that was one email that I got rejecting a piece of mine. And then over here is another one that was mailed to me in an envelope. We shall not be using your manuscript. Thank you, however, for giving us the opportunity to consider it. And then someone penciled in on the side, sorry, with some initials. I don't know if that was supposed to help me, make me feel better, but clearly these are two very different methods of rejecting someone's work. The message is obvious in both of them that they won't be publishing my work. And this is also obviously a form letter. I'm sure they send the same letter to each person who gets rejected. And I know by the first line, thank you for your submission, that my piece hasn't been accepted. I even know from the subject line, regarding your submission. So I'm already prepared for the bad news, but they start with something that we both can agree on. Memoir writing takes courage. So I'm thinking, yeah, it did take courage. Showing a memoir to others can be even more difficult. I'm thinking they're right. They understand it was difficult for me to send it. So they kind of are starting with statements that we both can agree on before they get to the bad news that they won't be reading my manuscript. And then they invited me to submit again. So they ended with something positive. So they're really trying to maintain a good relationship to me. They know that I could potentially write for them one day, and also that I could be a subscriber to the magazine. So this is really an indirect approach, very effective for delivering that bad news. This one is clearly direct. There's no buffer at all. We shall not be using your manuscript. It's very short. They're not inviting me to submit again. In fact, it was a larger journal, and they probably were overrun with submissions. However, I'm still potentially a subscriber to that journal, and after getting a rejection letter like that, I'm not going to subscribe to it or buy it as a gift subscription for anyone or recommend it to anyone either. So you really do have to make a choice when you're delivering bad news as to whether you're going to be direct or indirect. So we'll go over some strategies for that right now. So you have to keep in mind the purposes of your message, and I may have gone over some of these in the previous example. You absolutely have to convey the bad news. So even though we're talking about being indirect, that doesn't mean we're muddying the message. The message needs to be clear. You want the recipient to gain acceptance for the bad news. You want to maintain as much goodwill as possible with your audience, as well as a good image for your organization, whoever you're writing on behalf of, because you don't know when down the road you might be in contact with this person again. And then if appropriate, you need to reduce or eliminate the need for future correspondence. You don't want them emailing or calling or writing you back with questions, so you may need to give them enough of an explanation that they're satisfied, they accept the bad news, and move on. The reading for this week included different types of business letters. If you are sending routine or positive messages, always be direct. In the business world, people are busy. They want to know your main idea in the first sentence. So there really is no reason to save the main idea for later if the news is good. And this is just a list here on the slide of some different types of business letters that you might find yourself writing in the workplace, asking for information and action, all the way down to just announcing simple good news in the company. If you are writing negative messages, your book takes the stance that you should always be indirect. I think that really you have a choice when you're delivering a negative message of whether you're going to be direct or indirect. And I'll give you some strategies for making that choice on the next couple of slides. So here are some examples of negative messages that you might be giving in the workplace. Just negative announcements on routine business matters, rejecting suggestions, refusing claims and requests for adjustment, refusing a request for an employee reference or recommendation letter, rejecting a job applicant, giving a negative performance review, or terminating someone's employment. So how do you choose whether to be direct or indirect? And again, I'm straying from the book a little bit here. The book really takes the stance that if it's bad news, you should always provide some kind of a buffer. I take the stance that you really have a choice. You should be direct if the audience is already aware of the bad news. There's no reason to be indirect. If the audience isn't emotionally involved, you can be direct. If you're writing to a large audience, it's okay to be direct when delivering bad news. If you know this particular audience and they need firmness, you may need to be direct. If you would like to discourage a response, a direct approach might help with that. If you know this individual and this individual would just prefer that you give the bad news first. Or if it's a crisis or an emergency situation, then you obviously need to give the bad news directly first. I would only be indirect if the audience is not prepared, if they might be shocked by this bad news, or if the audience has high emotional investment in this bad news, or if you're writing to a small audience or an individual. So there is some crossover here. You still have to make a choice. And one of the things that we'll do on the business letter exam that you take, it's a take-home exam, is that you will be given a situation, and it might be good news, in which case you'd be direct, or it might be bad news, in which case I want you to make a choice, and then you'll need to explain to me, why you chose to be direct or indirect, and you should use some of these strategies in your explanation. But again, the choice is yours. You just need to be able to support it. So I would practice right now. Just pause the video for a moment and consider these scenarios and decide whether you would be direct or indirect and be able to support your position. So for the first one, you have to tell an internal candidate that he or she is not being selected for a higher position. Well, this is an internal candidate, so it's someone that you know well. You're going to be dealing with them on a daily basis, so you definitely want to maintain a good relationship. And this person, obviously, they want the job, so they are emotionally invested. So I would definitely take an indirect approach when I was giving this bad news. For number 2, you have to notify residents of a community that a bus route or hours of operation are being discontinued. For this one, I would probably be direct. It's an entire community. It's kind of a bummer that, the hours of the bus route is being canceled, but you need to just get the information out there. So I would think a direct approach would be fine. For number 3, you have to inform a vendor that you will no longer be purchasing their product. For this one, you've probably been working with this vendor for a long time, and who knows, you may want to work with them again in the future. So I think this one would call for an indirect approach. For number 4, you need to officially inform your staff that the number of sick days allowed per year will be reduced from 9 to 7. I could probably go either way on this one. I think, people will be upset about it, but you're dealing with a lot of people. You're talking to a broad audience, and it may be the kind of thing that they sort of have already heard through the grapevine, so they're expecting it. So a direct approach could also be okay. And number 5, you are the manager of an insurance company writing to tell one of your customers that because of reckless driving, his or her rates will increase. For this one, I would probably be indirect because this is one of your customers. You want to keep them as a customer, so I would probably give them some kind of buffer to soften the blow. But again, whenever you're delivering bad news, you have to make sure that the message is clear. And I'd also like to add that in your individual program areas, these strategies may be utilized slightly differently. I know that we often have discussions about criminal justice when delivering bad news, for example, that there's been a death, that they actually do take a direct approach when doing that in their speech, although they may do things like, have the person sit down and make sure they're relaxed before they tell them about the death. So to sum up, good news, take a direct approach. Bad news, you have a choice to be direct or indirect, and you'll want to get those strategies in your notes so that when you take the business letter practical exam, you can provide support for the approach that you choose.